U.S. presidential elections are tomorrow, and Democratic nominee Kamala Harris has some pretty significant ties to Hamas's supporters in Washington. I'll have information on that. And in the midst of the presidential elections, when everybody's watching Washington, Israel's security brass is trying to oust Prime Minister Netanyahu from power. That's right, a coup. I'll have all the details on that scandalous story as well. Both coming up on In Focus. In Israel, as usual, we're living in a split screen. On the one hand, we have the most fateful U.S. presidential elections in Israeli history that are going to be concluding after 2 months, of course, of early voting tomorrow, Tuesday, November 5th, the day that we've all been waiting for months and months and months. And it's coming tomorrow. And in the midst of all of this, it works out that at least, maybe everybody knows, maybe nobody knows, but I think it's very important on the eve of this election to point out some of the ties that Democratic nominee Kamala Harris has with an organization called the Council of American Islamic Relations, CARE, which was an unindicted co-conspirator in the largest terror financing case, the Holy Land Foundation and Trust case of 2008 in American history. So CARE is an organization that is ideologically and politically aligned with Hamas. It had ties in the past with Al-Qaeda, and it is also considered to be the most important Muslim American civil rights organization in the United States by people who refuse to acknowledge their terror ties. One of the people, and there are many, is Vice President Kamala Harris. And this week, some young researchers sent me some research that they had done, and it wasn't really uncovering anything new. And initially, I sort of poo-pooed it because I had written about this stuff over a decade ago. But all the same, it's actually important, and it bears noting on the eve of the election. So CARE, as I say, was an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation Trust terror financing trial of 2008. And that meant that the federal authorities, federal investigators from the FBI, Justice Department, were able to see direct ties between most or maybe even all of CARE's founders and senior officers and the Holy Land Foundation, which was an Al-Qaeda and Hamas front organization that was funding these two terrorist organizations, among others. And this was a case that was opened after 9/11. CARE itself was founded along with a lot of other American Islamist organizations in the 1990s. At any rate, in 2009, as a result of the findings in the Holy Land Foundation case and the court's verdict, the FBI cut off all ties with CARE. And they informed senators that inquired about it that indeed they had cut off all ties with CARE pending any sort of clearance of their ties with Hamas. But that clearance never came. All the same, the Obama administration ignored that finding in the court, and they began welcoming CARE representatives into the White House regularly. Hundreds of meetings were carried out during Obama's 8 years in office at the White House with CARE officials. Okay, so that was what happened. And then in 2018, CARE was having this major event celebrating their 24th anniversary since the founding of CARE. And 100 Democratic lawmakers sent letters to CARE on the occasion of their anniversary dinner, congratulating them for all of their accomplishments. Nobody, of course, mentioned the Holy Land Foundation case or the fact that CARE was both an unindicted co-conspirator and had been exposed as having legion ties with Hamas and Al-Qaeda front organizations, but particularly Hamas. So then Senator Kamala Harris, who was also a member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, so she was in a position to actually know about CARE's ties to Hamas. She was one of the 100 Democratic lawmakers who sent letters to CARE for the occasion. And among other things, she wrote, "In the face of intolerant and exclusionary policies, CARE has steadfastly defended the constitutional rights of American Muslims who aspire to build better lives for their families and contribute to our communities and our great nation. Once again, thank you for your commitment to protecting civil liberties and making the promise of America real for all Americans. Best wishes for a memorable celebration." So whatever. Okay, so she wrote them this nice letter, but that's not all that happened. Kamala Harris, as vice president, had her husband, who's Jewish, Doug Emhoff, appointed to chair a presidential commission that was supposed to put together a strategy for fighting anti-Semitism. This was in 2023, well before October 7th and the spasm of anti-Semitism that Jews in America have experienced in an unprecedented way for more than a year since October 7th. What happened before October 7th, of course, was another spasm of anti-Semitism. It wasn't as powerful, but it was the most powerful wave of anti-Semitism that the United States has experienced. How do we know this? Because the data on anti-Semitic attacks in the United States shows that year after year, the number of anti-Semitic attacks in the United States has been growing, doubling, practically every single year. So in 2023, it was already horrible for Jews on campuses in particular, but not only. Jews were already being isolated and ostracized in key nodes of American society, particularly in Hollywood. I mean, there was an article that came out in Tablet magazine, I think well before October 7th, called The Vanishing Jews, which was talking about how Jews are being pushed out of all of the professions that they had previously been so prominent in, including, of course, Hollywood. That was just one. Anyway, so Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, was supposed to put together this strategy. And who did they bring into the team that was supposed to put together this strategy for fighting anti-Semitism? None other than CARE. CARE, which was an anti-Semitic Islamist organization with ties to a genocidal terrorist organization, Hamas, was brought into Kamala Harris's husband's task force for putting together a national strategy for fighting anti-Semitism in the United States. So this already made it a joke. And then in May of 2023, Emhoff announced the findings and they put out their strategy paper. So their strategy paper, which was their strategy for fighting anti-Semitism in the United States, involved ignoring the most important, the most powerful, the most politically powerful, and the most dangerous form of anti-Semitism in the United States, which is, of course, anti-Zionism. So anti-Zionism had been recognized as a form of anti-Semitism by the Trump administration. The Biden administration came in and said, there's this crisis of Jew hatred in the United States. We're going to solve it. How do we solve it? It wasn't that they completely said that anti-Zionism isn't a form of anti-Semitism. They just watered the whole thing down so that the fact that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, in fact, the most prominent form of anti-Semitism in the United States or in the world really today, was watered down to the point where making the point suddenly became debatable, so that you had to actually prove anytime. You couldn't just say that rejecting the Jewish people's right to national self-determination and the civil right of American Jews to support the Jewish people's right to self-determination by saying that was not acceptable and ostracizing them for holding such opinions. That was suddenly something that had to be seen as on a case-by-case basis. You couldn't just say, well, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. In other words, the Emhoff Commission, in which CARE was a member, made it impossible for the federal government to do anything effective to fight anti-Semitism in the United States. And again, this was before October 7th. And among the groups that were charged with implementing this strategy, that is, fighting anti-Semitism in the United States, was, again, CARE. That's right, CARE. So CARE was brought in to implement a policy that was supposed to fight anti-Semitism, but because of the way that it was written, it was clear that its policy was to block anybody from actually fighting anti-Semitism. That was the Emhoff Commission. That's Kamala Harris's husband, and he brought CARE into the commission and made them one of the implementing organizations charged with implementing his strategy for fighting anti-Semitism that CARE was involved in authoring. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is that, there are these CARE officials who received senior positions, not only in Kamala Harris's office of vice president, but also in her campaign. And I just want to read to you a couple of excerpts from my friend Daniel Greenfield's article in Front Page Magazine that came out in September of this year, called Kamala's Islamist BDS, Al-Qaeda Killed the Jews, and Kamala's Incredible Muslim Team. So I'm just going to read a few excerpts. So first of all, he says, he quotes, during the blessed last 10 days of Ramadan, we celebrate our administration's incredible Muslim team, Vice President Kamala Harris announced posing on the steps of the Eisenhower Executive Office building with some of the most controversial figures in the administrations. So the first one, there is right behind Kamala is Nasrina Bargzi, her deputy counsel and future Muslim liaison for her campaign, who had been interviewed by the FBI after 9/11, wore orange for the Islamic terrorists at Gitmo, and had fought a lawsuit. Fought a lawsuit brought by Jewish students over harassments by pro-terrorist activists at Berkeley. So she had written an article opposing a lawsuit that was brought by a Jewish Berkeley law student who had been accosted and beaten by pro-Hamas bands at Berkeley. This was back like in 2013. So this was over a decade ago. And Bargzi was right there protecting the Hamas supporters on Berkeley and saying that it was a free speech issue and that Jews weren't allowed to complain about being accosted, being beaten, being assaulted by these pro-Hamas rioters on their campus. And so she was at the forefront of doing that. She was questioned by the FBI, and as Daniel pointed out in another article about her, the thing that was absurd about the thing that's so distressing about it is that she was at Berkeley, which is a totally leftist campus, anti-American, pro-terror, whatever. I mean, it's a place where she flourishes. And yet, she was apparently so over the top after 9/11 that her friends felt it necessary to complain about her to the FBI, and the FBI came and questioned her after her friends had complained that they had fears that she had ties, apparently, to terrorism. Otherwise, the FBI wouldn't have come. All right. Then a second person who was in that picture with Kamala was Brenda Abdallah, and she had taken part in anti-Israel protests in college and falsely accused Israel of ethnic cleansing as part of brutal occupation. She became the Assistant Secretary for Partnership and Engagement at the Department of Homeland Security in the Biden-Harris administration, and then appeared at a convention where speakers had called for a caliphate ruled by Islamic law and freeing Islamist terrorists. She was recently chosen to head Kamala's Arab American outreach, and the campaign refused to part ways with her over her past comments accusing Jews of controlling America. Okay? And there are more and more and more. And of course, you have near the top of the stairs was Abdallah Hassan, a recipient of a CARE Islamic Scholarship Fund, who defended BDS for the American Civil Liberties Union and claimed, quote, Islamophobia is rampant even in our highest, where is it? Can't get these darn stages. He said, Islamophobia is rampant even in our highest democratic institutions like the Supreme Court. And then he became the assistant press secretary for the Biden-Harris administration. We can add to that, of course, there's just so much stuff going on here. This is all so terrible. It says here, Kamala's pose with a record number of Muslim staffers estimated to be over 100 in the Biden-Harris administration was also a measure of her personal relationship with some of them, like Nasrina Bargzi, one of her fabulous 4 staffers who had stayed with her throughout her time in office, as well as others, Brenda Abdallah, who she had developed a relationship with and would make her part of a future presidential campaign. As the Attorney General of California, Kamala had developed long-standing ties with CARE, whose founder has, and then we'll get to that in a second. So she had a long time ago developed, when she was still, in her first office as Attorney General of the state of California, she had already developed these very close ties to CARE. And here I just want to show, so CARE is now, as of May 2023, they're supposed to be implementing this great vaunted strategy for fighting anti-Semitism in the United States that was put forward by the second gentleman himself, the first Jew to ever be a second gentleman or second spouse or whatever in American history. And he may be the first gentleman if Kamala Harris is elected. And so what did CARE say? So here I just want to play you a clip of what is his name? Ahmed Awad said. He's the executive director of CARE at a dinner of the American Muslims for Palestine, which is another organization that fronts for Palestinian terrorists, that apologizes for Palestinian terrorists operating in Washington. By the way, Condoleezza Rice also spoke at their annual dinner when she was Secretary of State, I believe, and said some pretty noxiously Israel things at that occasion. But all the same, here is Ahmed Awad from CARE speaking at the AMP dinner in December about October 7th. And again, remember, his organization was appointed to be part of the implementing team for the anti-Semitism strategy or fighting strategy put forward by the second gentleman, the Jewish guy, Doug Emhoff. Just listen to what he says about October 7th.
The people of Gaza only decided to break the siege, the walls of the concentration camp, on October 7th. And yes, I was happy to see people breaking the siege and throwing down the shackles of their own land and walk free into their lands that they were not allowed to walk in.
So what do we have here? We have this guy who was lauded by the administration as being the civil rights guy, by Harris herself, whose Muslim staffers are aligned with, have joined with, have been affiliated with CARE over the years. She herself has been affiliated with CARE going back to the time that at least to the time that she was the Attorney General of the state of California. And she has appointed these two Islamic anti-Semites to be her Muslim and Arab American outreach directors in her campaign. Okay, and here's Awad saying, that the Jews have no right to self-defense and that what Hamas did was fantastic on October 7th. And he's a frequent visitor to the Biden-Harris administration, to the White House, to the Eisenhower office building, et cetera. So then they were embarrassed and they took CARE off the list on the website and they said they were no longer going to be involved in implementing it. How long do you think it's going to last? Well, given the fact that after that had already happened, that was exposed in December, she appointed these two women to be her Muslim and Arab American outreach directors, and they both have a track record of seeking the annihilation of Israel effectively and denying American Jews their basic civil rights on campuses and off campuses. And then you have Maher Bitar, who is the senior director of military operations and intelligence operation at Biden's National Security Council. And Maher Bitar, it's been reported widely that he is the top contender to be the director of national intelligence under Kamala Harris administration. And Maher Bitar he worked for UNRWA, the UN's in-house Palestinian terrorist organization that was involved with carrying out October 7th, that has acted as an auxiliary force or an actually fused force with Hamas since October 7th in the war against Israel. Its headquarters are Hamas headquarters. Its schools are launching pads for missiles, so are its clinics. They've held hostages. They've taken hostages. They've seized the body of a dead Israeli on October 7th from Israeli territory and brought it back to Gaza. UNRWA officials have held terrorists in their homes, starved terrorists in their homes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the Knesset just outlawed UNRWA, as I discussed in my last show, and the administration is very, very angry about it, and you can understand why, because Maher Bitar is a former employee of UNRWA. He's very close to UNRWA, just as he's very close to all these BDS organizations that want to ostracize not only Israel, but all American Jews who support Israel, right? And cause them economic damage and social ostracism again. Now, that's Maher Bitar, and he's one of the top contenders to be the director of national intelligence or to receive, and if he can't be confirmed, if the Republicans win control over the Senate, then they'll give him, national security advisor or something else. It's a very senior position, which accords with their respect for this man who seeks the annihilation of Israel very clearly through his affiliations and his actions. So that's who Kamala Harris has been embracing for the entirety of her public career. And that's what she continues to embrace on the campaign trail. And by the way, right, her Jewish outreach guy is this guy named Elon Goldenberg, who, basically has a track record of hating Israel and supporting, the likes of Bargzi and Abdalal and Ariana Tabatabai, who has been figured as an Iranian regime agent who's working in the Defense Department in a senior position there, and so on and so forth. So Elon Goldenberg, her Jewish outreach advisor, I think Daniel wrote it, hates Israel, and so do her Arab and Muslim outreach director. So everybody's basically on board with the same thing. And here I'll just add one last thing. Who is President Trump's closest Jewish advisor? Oh, what's his name? Let's see. He was on my last show. His name would be former Ambassador David Friedman. David Friedman. That's Trump's closest advisor. So I guess what I can basically say is I rest my case, right? So that's my last word, I guess you might say, on the U.S. presidential election. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. That's not our job here at JNS. That's not my job. I'm just giving you the information. You know, if you want the Muslim Brotherhood aligned organizations that support Hamas and Israel's destruction, then you vote one way. If you want Israel to win the war and you want the United States to support Israel, then you might want to go another way. That's all I'm going to say. Enough said. Now I just want to move to the military coup that we're in the midst of here in Israel. Just like a little side issue that doesn't have to, be of interest to anybody, right? So where are my notes on this? Okay, here we go. So to understand what's going on, first I'll give you the headline. So right now, a former spokesperson for Prime Minister Netanyahu named Eli Feldstein has been in jail. He's been in a Shabak, that is a Shin Bet, sort of like our FBI jail for the past week, been denied access to an attorney as if he is a terrorist, because they're mainly the people who aren't given the right to speak to an attorney while they're undergoing interrogation. So Eli Feldstein, who is he worked for the Director General of the Prime Minister's office for a while. And he was considered an excellent spokesman, by the way. So he was arrested last week, and he is being held by the Shabak, along with, I think, 2 or 3 people from the army. And this is being billed as just, a serious security breach that's under investigation from the Prime Minister's office, and it's being investigated by the Shabak, and they immediately put a gag order on it so that you could get almost no information except that this guy is from the Prime Minister's office. It's a leak from the Prime Minister's office. It endangered Israel's national security. So little by little, as the story was reported on, splashed on the front pages of the New York Times by an Israeli reporter named Ronen Bergman, who also works for the New York Times, so that he's able to get around the judicial gag order by publishing it in the Times rather than in Israel. So what we know from the story is that in September, at the very beginning of like September 6th, I think it was, or September 4th, so 2 months ago, the German newspaper Bild published a story about Hamas's negotiating strategy. It was based on information that was taken from a computer that Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar had used, and it was clear that it had been approved by him. Now, this report from Bild, which was published on September 4th, came out shortly after Hamas executed 6 Israeli hostages, I think on September 1st. So September 1st, they execute the 6 hostages. September 4th or so, Bild puts out this report about Hamas's negotiating strategy for hostage releases. And in between those two things, the anti-Netanyahu rioters were organizing the hostages' families to start reinvigorating their anti-government demonstrations in Tel Aviv, with breathless reporting, of course, from all of Israel's news stations and radio, television, and almost all of the newspapers, as is their wont. So they use the execution of the 6 hostages by Hamas as a means to try to reinvigorate the calls for Netanyahu to be ousted from power. And the Bild story sort of was a cold shower to those anti-government demonstrations, and they sort of petered out after that. Why? Well, Bild wasn't reporting any new information. As I said, this information was gleaned from Hamas's computers in January, and it was reported in the Israeli media. And at the time, the army and the Shabak, the Shin Bet, all poo-pooed it, said, well, yeah, but it's not that important. So what was in that negotiations guidance paper memo that the IDF found in these Hamas computers? Well, the Bild story, it reported basically it was Hamas's negotiating strategy, and all the information. And what it showed was that, actually, let me find the story itself. I printed it out for myself. The Jerusalem Post wrote up the Bild story, in an article that was published on September 6th. And it said, and the headline is Psychological Warfare, Sinwar-approved document highlights Hamas's negotiating tactics. The document apparently states that Hamas intentionally abuses hostages to leverage its negotiating positions. That's basically a summary of the findings, but I'm just going to go through a couple of the things that it says. The document apparently states that Hamas intentionally abuses hostages to leverage its negotiating position. It instructs, quote, continue to exert psychological pressure on the families of the hostages both now and during the first phase of the ceasefire so that public pressure on the enemy government increases. So all of these things is to try to increase public pressure on the government to make concessions to Hamas. You want to psychologically tortured the hostages' family. So, among other things, just I think 2 weeks ago, Israel's Channel 14's flagship show, The Patriots, interviewed the mother of one of the hostages, and she retold how she received phone calls from terrorists in Gaza, said that they were holding her son and that they expected her to participate in anti-government operations, to go to The Hague, and to complain against the IDF and how Israel was conducting the war. And if she didn't do that, and if she didn't participate in these anti-government demonstrations in Tel Aviv and other places, that bad things were going to happen to her son, with worse things than being held hostage by these animals. So she actually received threats from Hamas directly, or she actually said that she thought that they were Iranian, that they had Iranian accents, which wouldn't be surprising. So either from Iranian agents or from Hamas, this woman, this poor woman, her son is being held hostage in Gaza. She was contacted and told that she had to protest against the government of Israel, file complaints at The Hague against the IDF if she wanted to see her son again. So that's a form of psychological torture. And then, the hostage videos that come out, and they all have the exact same text. They're all blaming Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, for the plight of the hostages. So it's all the same. It's Hamas's texts that are being dictated to the hostages, who then become Hamas's spokespeople, who are simply repeating the text that they are required to say by their captors. So we had that, of course, with the hostage videos that were a form of psychological torture. After Israel found the bodies of the six hostages that were murdered, Hamas released the videos of all 6 of them, each in turn saying the exact same thing, that it's the prime minister's fault that they're being held in Gaza. So that you have this alignment of interest between the people who want to oust Netanyahu inside of Israel and Hamas, which wants pressure on the government to overthrow the government because they think that Netanyahu is going to destroy them. So they want him out so that they can survive the war, and the anti-Netanyahu opposition want him out because they don't want to share power with the right, and they want all the power to themselves. And so, so this report comes out in the Bild. And, it also, the Bild report also said that, there's other stuff, like the Bild report said that Hamas wants for an international Arab force to be in charge of Hamas's Gaza's border with Israel, so that the IDF will be able to operate in Gaza at the end of the war, and then they'll be able to rebuild their forces, and so that's what they want. And by the way, this is also an American position, that they want to have a pan-Arab force operating in Gaza as well. So we see an alignment here between Hamas and the Biden-Harris administration, which is notable. But the other thing that the Hamas document said, which was published in Bild, was that Israel has to be scapegoated for the failure of hostage negotiations. And of course, Hamas doesn't have any intention of releasing the hostages. This we know from other documents that were already exposed by Hamas. And the administration itself admits that the reason that there hasn't been a hostage deal is because Hamas refuses to make one. Why? Because why would they want to give up the hostages? That's their insurance policy. That's why they're still around, right? That's how they see it, and not incorrectly. So the Bild report was excellent for Israel, right? You put out this Hamas document, put it out into the international arena, and it makes the case again. It again exposes the evil of Hamas, and that Israel isn't the side that's blocking a deal, that Hamas is deliberately torturing psychologically and physically the hostages, and psychologically torturing their families to force them to act as Hamas's advocates inside of Israel and in the international arena to place all of the blame, to scapegoat Israel for Hamas's crimes. So putting this out there is very good for Israel. It's also very good for the hostages, because then suddenly people begin to realize both how desperate their plight is, and also how desperate the need to annihilate Hamas is in order to both secure their freedom and also because this kind of evil can't continue to exist. So all of these things are good for Israel, for the hostages, for our war aims. So you'd think that everybody would be happy. No, because who is it bad for? Well, it's bad for Hamas, but it's equally, if not even more horrible for the forces inside of Israel, particularly, what are you going to do? The leaders of Shabak, Ronen Bar, the head of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, who are trying to outlive Netanyahu and they won't resign, right? And they have been blocking a lot of this information from coming out throughout the war, because it both exposes the problematic nature of the left's continued efforts to oust the prime minister from power, and their defeatism, their refusal to, their desire not to win the war. I mean, their attempt to block the operation in Rafah is case in point. Also, their desperate support for a ceasefire in Lebanon, even though they knew that Hezbollah had this advanced weaponry, this frightening quantity of arms and personnel, literally meters from Israeli communities in northern Israel. And it was all pointed right at them, at Manara, at Kfar Giladi, at Betula, at Kiryat Shmona. I mean, these people's lives, our people, Israeli citizens, their lives were in constant danger, because you had, thousands of Hezbollah terrorists who were just, a couple hundred meters away from them, armed to the teeth with some of the most advanced weapon systems imaginable, whether it's everything from anti-tank rockets to high-grade explosives to night goggles and all of the rest of the things you need in order to stage a successful invasion of the Upper Galilee, right? And yet Herzi Halevi was suing for a ceasefire, as was Ronen Bar. And it's shocking. How can they possibly agree for Israel to continue to live with this kind of threat perched meters from the homes of Israeli civilians? Well, because, and so here you have the situation where this Eli Feldstein and 3 IDF people are being accused of stealing classified information from the IDF and publishing it. And they're being denied legal counsel. I think one of them was actually let out of the Hamas, out of the Shabak jail. But Eli Feldstein hasn't. And this is a guy who's well respected as a spokesperson. He was spokesperson for the division, the Judea and Samaria division in Central Command during his military service. And he's got a record. So what they're saying now is that Shabak refuses to allow him to speak to an attorney or to release him, even though he's not accused of any major crime, because they're trying to turn him into a state witness against who? Oh, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, why would they want to do that in the middle of a war for something that didn't damage Israel's security one iota? And what they always do is they make these special pleadings. They have special knowledge that we don't. They have all of the clearances that we don't have. It damages sources and methods. You have sources in Hamas that aren't dead yet? What are you talking about, sources? Sources and methods of what? We got this from a Hamas computer. Why is this highly classified? All of this should be out in the public sphere already. Over the past year, the IDF spokesman's unit, Daniel Hagari, working as Herzi Halevi's spokesperson, advancing his political interests, not the interests of the army. Just have to say it, right? They have blocked the publication of so many things. For instance, the tunnels that we found that traversed the international border between Gaza and Egypt after we took over Rafah, the IDF spokesman's office didn't want those published. They were published because soldiers who had captured those tunnels, who had exposed those tunnels, had already posted them on WhatsApp. So they were already out there, right? It was because the soldiers exposed this information that wasn't supposed to be public. Nobody was supposed to know that they had dozens of tunnels that were, because how can you make the argument that Israel should leave Rafah, that we should leave the Philadelphia corridor? When you know what's there, you can't. So the whole point is that now they're trying to use this story in order to criminalize the prime minister's office and to criminalize the prime minister and accuse him of leaking sensitive information abroad, even though he's not under investigation. Nobody has said that he had anything to do with the publication of this article, but that's not true, because behind every prime minister's office is a pointing finger at the prime minister of Israel. And again, this was an article that only advanced Israel's national interests in this war, right? It just undermined the interests of the people who are trying to oust the prime minister, including the ones who are in the security services. So this is obviously a devastating situation. And one of the more shocking aspects of it, of course, is, and it's only under a partial gag order, so that they let out information that seemed to implicate the prime minister, but not the actual information about, why are any of these people being held in prison by not even by the police, but by the Shin Bet. Nobody is talking about that. That is shocking and appalling. This is Stasi kind of stuff. And the thing that's so horrible here is that you see just how desperate these people are. Why are they desperate? Why would they be desperate? Israel, we can win this war, right? And then maybe they can purge some of the stain of the fact that they're responsible for October 7th. If they win, but no, that's not the way that they see it. They see, also the U.S. presidential elections. So if Kamala wins, then they're going to get an American assistant ousting Netanyahu big time, right? Big time. You're going to see the ICC arrest warrant against Netanyahu coming out, by the end of the week. If Kamala wins, you're going to see all kinds of things happening, sanctions against government ministers. That's what they've been threatening, right? Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir. You're going to see all kinds of things coming down the pike. The administration's made very clear that they're going to use Biden's February 1st, 2024 executive order to start harming directly officials of the Israeli government, etc. And the ICC is just dying to put out this arrest warrant against Netanyahu. So, you're going to see all kinds of things happening, and they'll get a big assist from the United States. If Donald Trump, who is the favorite to win right now, but I don't want to tempt fate, but if he gets elected, then suddenly their American security blanket is gone. At least by January 20th, they're not going to have that kind of support from the United States for their efforts to oust Netanyahu from power. So they want to get it done now while everybody's thinking about something else. And, I was deliberating whether I want to even talk about this on the eve of the U.S. presidential election, but I think it's very important. We have major leaks that were coming out that were strategic information about Israel's operational plans, literally, that were imminent, that were supposed to take place, that were leaked every day from the security cabinet when Gadi Eisenkot and Benny Gantz were members of that security cabinet, and nobody ever investigated the leaks. And there were numerous times when Netanyahu was banging on the table saying, investigate these goddamn leaks. This is crazy. This is making it impossible for us to discuss anything because everything is leaked to the media. This is nuts. This is totally undermining our military missions. This is totally undermining our national security. And the state prosecution, the attorney general has not opened one investigation. IDF officers leaked faked films to the media that were faked, that alleged that IDF soldiers were raping, sodomizing Hamas terrorists at Taman Field jail. This was a total lie. It was a complete lie, and it turned into an international scandal and a Hasbara fiasco. It was done deliberately by people inside of the IDF high command, and it has yet to be investigated. Nobody's been investigated. Nobody. And then on October 7th, a spy infiltrated Southern Command, an Israeli, with a cell phone, right? And he was taking pictures of the most sensitive classified information in Israel. Who did he give it to? They know. He was arrested 7 days later on the most serious espionage charges in the law book in Israel. And then he was suddenly declared unfit to stand trial because of insanity. The guy is not insane. He's a lawyer. He served in an intelligence unit in the IDF. And he apparently came into Southern Command with an officer from one of the anti-Netanyahu protest groups. Okay? And there's a huge gag order on the whole thing. There's a gag order on everything, every aspect of it, and they've canceled the trial because they've claimed without a whit of proof that the guy is nuts. He's actually appealing the ruling that says that he's crazy because he thinks that the whole investigation of him has become so tainted that he'll beat all the charges anyway. So he wants to get out, right? But to block anybody from talking about it, they put a gag order on it, just like they've done with Eli Feldstein. But nobody's allowed to talk about it. And there are implications, there are innuendos. It's already been reported that he was transferring the information to anti-Netanyahu protest movement leaders, including senior politicians, and to the State Department. So do we know any of this for a fact? No, because it's all behind a gag order. We're not allowed to know. And then they go after Feldstein. So, there are a lot of people in Israel who are very, very smart. And they're beginning, where they have long believed in a conspiracy that it was Ronen Bar and Herzl Halevi who were working with Yahya Sinwar ahead of October 7th. And that's why they didn't inform Netanyahu of what was going on the night of October 6th, October 7th, when they got all the indications that Hamas was about to invade. I'm not one of those people. But the way that they're behaving with Eli Feldstein on the one hand, and the way that they've kept the most serious espionage case in Israeli history, literally under a gag order and not allowing anybody to investigate it or discuss it or find out what in the hell happened here on October 7th, all it does is gaslight. All it does is inflame the belief and the division in Israeli society and make everybody angrier at each other. And again, we're in the middle of a war for our national survival. Iran is threatening to attack us with massive, force, like now, today, tomorrow, right? You have soldiers being killed in Gaza because of the restrictions the Biden-Harris administration is placing on our offensive operations in Gaza. You have, in Lebanon, the administration is trying to give us an ultimatum that we have to accept a ceasefire, which would allow Hezbollah effectively to continue to operate the way it has under the aegis of the Hezbollah auxiliaries in UNIFIL and in the Lebanese armed forces. The United States wants to preserve Hezbollah effectively through this fake ceasefire deal that they're trying to coerce Israel into accepting. So the Biden-Harris administration is trying to force Israel to capitulate after a year and a month of war, as they have been trying to get us to capitulate for a year and a month. And, none of this is in the news today. Everything the news is talking about is a little bit about the election tomorrow, the most fateful, again, in the history of U.S.-Israel relations, arguably in U.S. history. A little bit about that. And then, they're talking about Eli Feldstein and this huge security breach at the prime minister's office and how Netanyahu was masterminding the whole thing. And, this is really disgusting. It's repulsive. I didn't want to talk about this. It's like, do I have to talk about this? And yeah, Caroline, you have to talk about it. So here I am telling you, this is what's happening in Israel, where the real problem, and you see it in America too, and I'm writing an article about it called The Bad Juice for JNS, which I hope it'll come out tomorrow if I have time to finish it, is that at the end of the day, all of this, everything, is about them hating their political opposition, whether it's Netanyahu or Smotrich and Ben Gvir and all of the voters for everybody's parties. They hate us more than they hate Hamas. And if what needs to happen in order to oust the right from power and seize power for the left again means Hamas winning this war, so be it. It's a sick thing. You see it in the United States in its own way there, where you have all of these disaffected liberals who will still not vote for Trump because they hate Trump's supporters, and the bad Jews who support Trump, of course, as well. In the case of the Jewish disaffected liberals, they hate them more than they care about the issues that they purport to champion in their careers. So I think, that's what we're seeing. This is sick. There's a sickness in our society. It's not just political. It's not just ideological. It's mainly about power and sharing it with people who you don't want to share it with. You want it all to yourself. You won't give it away. You're willing to stop at nothing. Look at poor Eli Feldstein in prison for a week on nothing in order to block the bad Jews or the bad Americans, us deplorables, from having a share of the power in our countries. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. I'm going to have a cup of tea And I'll talk to you again in a couple of days.